There are two things I believe are fundamentally true about Gilmore Girls. 1, Lorelai and Rory are insufferable, and 2, Lane Kim deserved better. In this video, we're going to reimagine Lane's story if she hadn't been done dirty by the writers and if Adam Brody hadn't left the show to be on the OC. I'll go through specifically how she was done dirty later in the video, but for now we need to summarise her home life and her love life. Lane's home life. Lane Kim is living like she's in the clink. She's on a steady diet of soy and eggless eggs, and she hides CDs under her floorboards. She lies to her mother about basically everything, because how else will she survive her mother's strict rules? The only boys her mother will entertain are good Korean Christian boys, which Lane isn't interested in. Across the show, Lane does show a propensity for a bit of white meat, some grade A all-American pink ham. The next section is about Lane's love life. The boys she dates I've called Lane's boys, or the boys from down the lane. And the first up is Hale Bale Boy. So Lane at the start of the show goes on this date with some boy on some Hale Bales, and he's going to be a future doctor, and he's the son of a business associate, an unnamed boy from the Hale Bale. His brother chaperones. If I was Lane, I would rather fall off that Hale Bale and let it drive over me. Next up is Patrick Blumenfield. Patrick is in band and Lane is in band, and for some reason one day out of nowhere she runs her hands through his hair without permission and while he's not looking. Has Lane heard of consent? She is indeed lucky this happened before the Me Too era. Of course she was embarrassed and she runs away, which is the correct response. Well, an apology would be the right response, but yes, running away too works. And somehow she finds the strength to go back to school the next day. She's stronger than me. The next boy from down the lane is Todd. Todd is a friend of Dean's, which tells you everything. He's a simple lad. Now, Lane requested a date with Todd when Rory starts dating Dean. So they go on a double date, all four of them, and Todd shows up wearing a Fugazi shirt, but he doesn't listen to them. Lane is a music snob, bless her heart, and so naturally she's not impressed by his lack of musical knowledge. Like I said, Todd's a simple lad. He doesn't have much going for him, nor does he have many thoughts going through his head. Unsurprisingly, Lane isn't into it from the moment the date pretty much starts. The date ends when her mother sees her leaving the cinema with him and she gets yelled at in the streets and grounded. Strangely enough, Todd feels a kind of vibe with Lane despite their lack of connection, and he calls her house and Lane has to pretend to be her own mother and forbids herself from seeing him. Next up, our only real glimmer of hope at this point, Henry Cho. Henry Cho is perfect for Lane and her mother. He's Korean, he speaks fluent Korean, he plans to be a doctor, and he's a Christian. Lane and Henry meet at a party. He asks her to dance to Miss Jackson by Outkast, which is a fantastic needle drop. In fact, they dance several times that night, and this leaves Lane a little bit torn. She likes Henry a lot, but he's so perfect for her mum, she worries she might get the ick. Regardless, they start talking on the phone, and it becomes a whole rigmarole. Essentially, Rory calls Lane and then dials in Henry, so that Henry and Lane can speak, and then while on the phone, Lane refers to Henry as Rory in case her mum is listening in. Y2K really was a scary time. The whole Henry-Lane storyline ends with a picnic basket auction. In yet another elaborate plan, Lane is using her cousin as a decoy so she can go on her first date with Henry, but naturally everything goes wrong. It ends with Henry calling Lane's house and her mum picking up, and her mum's like, well, who's this? And he tries to sell her a newspaper magazine subscription. Understandably, Henry decides all the sneaking around is too much. Which leads me to my question, when did either of them have time for schoolwork with all these love-fueled machinations? Henry also admits he asked someone else to prom because he never thought Lane would be able to go. And to add salt to the wound, Lane gets grounded. Lane's mum does become slightly regretful when she discovers Lane let a future Korean doctor, who is also a Christian, slip through her fingers. The next boy from down the lane, and in my opinion the greatest, is Dave Rygalski. Everybody scream for Dave! Ah. So Dave and Lane meet when she tries to form a band. He already has a band and they're looking for a drummer, so they bring her in. Very quickly, Lane realises she likes Dave, which makes sense. They have a lot in common, especially about music. They are both music nerds. So Lane joins the band, and Dave also manages to win Lane's mum over. There is a 24-hour dance-a-thon happening in town, and Dave shows up to see Lane. He ends up eating her mum's eggless egg sandwiches and pretending to love them. He also pretends that his parents go to Bible study, and her mum's just like, I love this for you. We love a boy that tells wholesome lies in the name of love, no? Next thing we know, it's Thanksgiving, and Dave is playing hymns at Mrs. Kim's house on the guitar, and he's being paid to be there. He's pocketing Mrs. Kim's hard-working dollars while he lies to her face about being a Christian guitarist. But a hustle is a hustle, no? Lane believes if her mum sees Dave in these spaces, she'll let Lane date him. When Dave leaves after Thanksgiving, she apologises for all the sneaking around, and he's like, I don't mind. He is a heathen after all. And then they kiss. Of course I'm joking about him lying. In reality, it's all harmless. Dave is a good chap who likes a gal, and her mum's very strict. They're doing what they've got to do, and really no one's getting hurt. Lane and Dave start dating, but they hide it from the band. Eventually, Lane asks her mum to go to prom, and she says she'll do it her mother's way. She thinks she'll okay her going with Dave because she let Dave sit in their pew at church on Sunday, which basically means Mrs. Kim loves him. But it turns out Lane is very, very mistaken, because her mother will not allow her to date Dave because he's not Korean, and instead sets her up with this boy called Young Chi. Once again, Lane comes up with a harebrained plan to get around her mother's rules. The plan is this. Lane will go on some dates with Young Chi, but then he'll dump her, and she'll be so heartbroken, her mum will let her go to the prom with Dave instead to make up for it. However, Young Chi doesn't stick to his side of the plan. He starts to catch feelings for Lane because apparently she's the flavour of the month and he won't let her go. Lane does eventually get to go to prom with Dave, however, after she gets drunk at a house party and calls her mum telling her everything about Dave and the band. As a form of damage control, Dave shows up to Mrs. Kim's front door wearing a suit and tries to convince her to let him go to prom with Lane. Mrs. Kim responds with a quote about the Lord, and Dave decides to go away and read the Bible in one night to figure out what she meant. Now, I'm wondering, was Google not a thing? I know these girls had computers, I saw them tippy-tapping on them to do their homework, no? But anyway, you do for love. And it turns out the quote wasn't from the Bible, but instead it was Shakespeare. Mrs. Kim is so impressed that Dave would do such a thing, and she lets him go to prom with Lane after all. However, she's grounded every day up until prom and for 2 months after it. Also, they can't get married. For all that, we don't actually see Dave and Lane at prom. I don't know if Adam Brody had left the show at this point to be on the OC, but it's a big shame. And it's interesting that Mrs. Kim says Dave can't marry Lane because that ends up being part of their breakup. Essentially, Dave goes to California for college and Mrs. Kim tries to send him a jug, which Lane believes is a marriage jug, meaning she approves them getting married. Dave thinks they're too young and they get in a fight or something, and essentially they break up and we don't really hear about him again. To be honest, we don't even really hear about the breakup itself. He just stops being mentioned. It's all a bit strange and it does a disservice to their relationship because they don't even get a proper breakup or any kind of real closure. The next boy from down the lane is Zack. I don't like Zack, so I'll keep it brief. Lane gets chucked out of her house because her mum discovers her contraband in the floorboards, etc. So she moves in with Zack the bozo and Brian. Lane gets feelings for Zack, Zack gets feelings for Lane. They go on a date where they watch TV in their living room. So pedestrian, so boring, so sad. My god. They get married at 19 or 20 or 21 or something. They go on a honeymoon to Mexico and it's terrible. They do the horizontal tango on the beach and it's also terrible. Lane thinks she's sick, but actually she's pregnant. My question is, what's the difference? She has twins, and Lane never leaves Stars Hollow. It's like they didn't want to make Lane someone who could ask for more. What a low-rent, low-effort relationship that moved at the literal speed of light. The only part of the relationship I liked with Zack was the time he spent with Mrs. Kim. She told him that if he wants to be a musician, he needs to learn how to write hits, and together they work on a song that she believes could be a hit. That was sweet, but everything else about Zack is just blah. In the revival, we see Lane, still living in Stars Hollow. She works with her mum, which I guess is a self-fulfilling prophecy because at school, she did an aptitude test that said she'd be really good at selling things, a salesperson, and she literally said she did not want to become her mother, but of course, that's what happened. She's still with Zack, and he gets a promotion at work. Hep Alien, their band, are still together and they practice at Lane and Zack's house sometimes, and weirdly we see her dad for the first time. So that was a recap of Lane's life by way of Lane's boys. Just a quick summary of why I like Dave and why I do not like Zack. So Dave is thoughtful, ambitious and sweet. He doesn't play games and he's determined to do what it takes to be with Lane despite her mother's rules. Adam Brody is a charming actor and therefore very likeable on screen. Lane and Dave are just very cute together. Zack, on the other hand, is lazy and petulant and selfish. There's so little effort on his part with Lane. Their first date was literally just watching TV. He has no ambition or drive and he's insecure. He doesn't know how to communicate. It's like the writers just wanted Lane to have a love interest just to have a love interest. Lane's storyline with Zack sucks. She gets pregnant so young, she doesn't get to explore the world or her dreams. She doesn't get to leave Stars Hollow, and she basically becomes her own mother. I'm not saying Lane should be some sort of rock star. But why doesn't she get to have an exciting career being an agent or a manager or a scout or a critic? Why doesn't she get to try something? Even if she went out into the world and failed and then settled back into Stars Hollow, at least that would have been something. At least she would have tried. I'm annoyed that the writers didn't even give her a chance for more. And so, because Lane doesn't get the story she deserves, I want to reimagine her life with Dave if he hadn't left. Let's imagine the events of seasons 1 to 3 have taken place, and now it's season 4. So Dave is going to college, but he's commuting, and it's maybe an hour's drive. Mrs. Kim could discover Lane's band stuff and her music stuff and chuck her out. So Lane then moves into Rory's dorm, which is what happens in the show. But we could have Dave try to fix things between Mrs. Kim and Lane. He could ferry care packages for Mrs. Kim to Lane at Rory's dorm. Then Rory's roommates decide Lane needs to leave, which we see happen in the show. Lane could float the idea of moving in with Dave and them getting a place together. But he could say it's too soon and he wants her to fix things with her mum. Lane could feel quite rejected by this, on top of being chucked out from home and from Rory's dorm. Then Lane ends up living with Brian and Zack, as she does in the show. We could see Mrs. Kim visit Lane at their apartment and freak out, which is what happens in the show also. I think Lane could become more withdrawn and unhappy with her life in comparison to people like Rory or even Dave, people who are doing things towards the future, something she feels like she doesn't have. As a result, things between Dave and Lane could be quite off, but he doesn't know how to fix things or what's wrong. During band practice one day, Lane could be really sad about her life, and she could say to Dave, "We're over," and also leave the band. By this point, she could be disillusioned that she could ever be a successful musician. So Lane's quit the band and broken up with Dave, but she still lives in the house where they practice. This makes things awkward when Dave comes over for band practice. He tries to convince her to get back together, and she says that it's not him, it's her. The band try to look for a new drummer and somehow end up with a new guitarist. This could be Gil. He's in the band originally after Dave leaves, and I think it would be fun to keep him in the band. Him and Dave interacting could be quite fun. Meanwhile, Lane moves in with Lorelai, and Lorelai tells Mrs. Kim, "Lane's living with me now," and she tries to reconcile things between them, but it doesn't work. Now that Dave and Lane have broken up and she's moved out, he only really sees her at Luke's diner, where she works. He could psych himself up to go in there and sit and order food just to see her. I think I like the idea of him sitting, writing songs in there. Cleaning up one day, Lane could be upset that she doesn't have a relationship with music anymore. And Luke convinces her that she can have one, but maybe something slightly different. This inspires Lane to try something new. She starts a blog. I think a blog makes sense for this era. The early 2000s were very into that kind of thing, and so Lane could review live music and performances. I like the idea of Lane's blog being successful. I also like the idea of Dave seeing Mrs. Kim regularly, maybe for tea, and they talk and chat and catch up. And during one of these catch-ups, he could mention Lane's blog. Mrs. Kim could then read Lane's blog and realise she's really talented. During a show that Lane aims to review, she discovers Hep Alien is performing there, unknown to her. She thinks about leaving but stays for her writing integrity. And just as the set closes and Lane's about to leave, over the microphone, Dave could tell her to stay a moment longer. Impromptu, he asked the band to play a song he wrote, and it's about Lane and how she can't be replaced. This is the song he's been writing in the diner. Lane and Dave could talk, and he could share that he misses Lane, and that he misses her like-minded view about music. Also, they need a drummer desperately, because 3 guitarists is an unbalanced sound. So Lane joins the band again, but she continues her blog. I think that could be the closing of one season for Lane. In the next season, Lane doesn't realise Dave wants to get back together. It's a very typical teen misunderstanding, but I don't plan to drag it out. So Lane is missing Dave's small advances, like offering to walk her home. One day she mentions to him that she managed to get tickets to this show, and Dave is the only other person that likes the band. So he not so subtly asks if he can come with, and she says yes. They go, she reviews the show, they have a lot of fun. Maybe he goes in to kiss her in the middle of the show, and something happens, so he misses his chance. He mentions he's been reading her blog and he loves it. They could end up staying late after the show and maybe partying with the band. It could be a cute escapade where they go from the party, which gets a bit hectic, and walking home, a tiny bit drunk. They could end up tumbling through the window of Lane's room at Lorelai's house. Then they sit on her bed and they kiss. He says he misses her and wants her back, and she says she wants the same thing, but also, let's have this conversation again sober in the morning. He agrees. I picture this scene where Lorelai comes in and finds them. She stands in the doorway and she says, "Hello, David," and he scrambles to leave, and as he does so, she says, "Goodbye, David." and he makes himself scarce and leaves through the front door. We could have Lane and Dave talk about their relationship. She could discuss that she wasn't in a great place emotionally, and that's why they broke up. Meanwhile, Mrs. Kim is still reading Lane's blog, and she realises that Lane has missed a very popular band that was playing and hasn't covered it on her site. Mrs. Kim could show up at Lorelai's house in a frenzy. She could tell Lane about her oversight by not covering this popular band. Mrs. Kim could also say she sorted a calendar of all these upcoming acts that Lane needs to see, and some publications she needs to reach out to for opportunities. Mrs. Kim could also say that if Lane wants to come home, she can, but there are rules. She's allowed to stay out late, but there's a curfew, and she must wear earplugs at all the gigs. Seeing her mother make such an effort, Lane moves home. This could be the end of the season. It feels like maybe not enough plot points, but you get the picture of what I'm going for. In between all of that, of course, there'll be things about Rory and Lane's friendship, so that could come in as well to pad things out. In the next season, Lane could have gone into college, maybe somewhere close by, and Dave drives her in the mornings and in the evenings. Dave has dinner with Lane and Mrs. Kim, and they realise that Dave needs to meet Mrs. Kim, and so does Lane. This could be a good opportunity to flesh out Dave and his storyline and his home life. So Dave now has to figure out how to get his parents to that dinner party and make it seem like they're Christians, which is what Dave told Mrs. Kim they were. We could also have a storyline in which Lane isn't enjoying college. However, she's applied for a position at a music label as an intern. The work she's doing she loves, and she decides to drop out of college without telling her mum. Lane considers telling Dave to lie to her mum about college and thinks, actually, I need to be honest with her for once. And so she has a frank conversation with her mother about what she's done. Naturally, Mrs. Kim won't be impressed, but they find a compromise, and she agrees to go to a community college while she works as an intern. We could see Lane doing really well at work, making good connections and inroads, and maybe someone from the label catches wind of her blog, and they say, hey, do you want to learn more from me? And they take her under her wing. This could be the start of a really exciting career for Lane. Again, there aren't huge many plot points in this section, but I'm thinking learning more about Dave's family life and again stuff with Rory could help fill this out. In this last season, Dave could decide he wants to propose to Lane, and he talks to Mrs. Kim about it. She says she wants him to finish school first, and she also needs him to be able to write a hit song. So together, Dave and Mrs. Kim work on writing a hit song. I'm stealing this from the original storyline with Zack because I think it's cute. Dave proposes after they graduate, and in this situation I'm okay with her getting married young, because in my storyline she doesn't get bogged down with just being a wife or a mother, she gets to have a life beyond that. There could be a version of this where they don't get married at all and they just live together, and that could challenge Mrs. Kim's perceptions and create an interesting storyline between them. I like the idea of Dave getting really into wedding planning with Mrs. Kim. I think that could be really cute and fun, and we could spend some time with that instead of cramming into like 1 or 2 episodes, which is what they do in the actual show. I also think Zack, Brian and Gil could get really into their roles as best men. We could see Lane and Dave get married in the same way Zack and Lane got married. I think that was also quite fun, the traditional wedding and then scrambling to get to the Christian wedding. I think it would also be nice if we see Lane and Dave share real vows. We don't get that in the original show because for some reason they focus on Lorelai and Christopher. Naturally, Dave and Lane will move in together, and Lane could get promotions at work, and her blog could continue getting good traction. Maybe she gets a piece published in another publication. It could be interesting if Lane's career is on the up and Dave is a bit stuck for what to do. He's happy for her, but he's a bit lost and misguided about his own future. Maybe Lane doesn't have time to be in the band anymore, which is a hard choice for her to make, and so they have to find a new drummer. And maybe Dave starts writing his own music. It could be cute if he continues writing songs with Mrs. Kim and they do in fact create hits. In the time jump, I imagine Lane and Dave living in a cool city, somewhere hip and fun. They could have a kid and Mrs. Kim could live with them. They both still work in music, so Lane could be a music scout or a manager or something like that. And Dave could be maybe a songwriter. He could write songs for other musicians or for film soundtracks. Maybe even a sound engineer or a music engineer in movies, something like that. They're both happy, but they worry they don't see each other enough. And so they start teaching their child an instrument together. And this could be a really cute family bonding moment. Maybe even have Alien arrive sometimes and they all like jam out together. There could be really fun sections where they teach their child about music and the great musicians they loved, and they raise a little cute music snob of their own. I think Dave and Lane's story could have been the best love story on the show, but alas, it wasn't meant to be. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what could have happened between Dave and Lane if he had stayed. While I was writing this video, I got some alternative ideas about Lane's life post-Dave. So there could be a storyline where Dave does leave, but she gets back with Henry Cho. Imagine she moves in with Zack and Brian, and then she manages to repair her relationship with her mother somehow. Then, unexpectedly, she reconnects with Henry. He could see that she's matured, she's grown, and she's not sneaking around lying anymore. And so he's excited by the chance of having a normal relationship. This could be a fun, full circle moment between them, and it could show her growth and depth. They could do things like deal with college long distance, and it could be fun if we subvert expectations. Maybe they don't get married super young, and they actually wait some time. Maybe they get married between the time gap, and we see them married in the revival. Another idea is that Dave does leave, and Lane does marry Zack, but she divorces him. In this timeline, I think that things could be the same up until Lane has the kids, and then she has this realization that Zack isn't mature enough or committed enough to their relationship or his responsibilities. Maybe she just wants more for herself. So she divorces him and she moves out and moves back in with her mother. Her mother helps her raise the children, but Lane is really firm that she cannot impose the same rules on them as she did to her. We could see Lane go out into the world, getting internships and placements in the music industry. Slowly but surely, she could work her way into a really great position and build a real life for herself. She could do well enough that she could move out of her mum's place and to a more interesting town or city. This storyline could work alternatively without the children, and Lane could still divorce Zack and move home and build her life from scratch. In fact, you could combine this storyline with the Henry Cho storyline. So after she divorces Zack, she bumps into Henry and thus they begin their relationship. That could be interesting, but there isn't enough time in the show itself to explore something like that properly. With all of that said, Lane will always be one of my favourite characters on the show. I will always lament the fact that she didn't get more out of life. I wonder why the writers chose the direction that they did for her life, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Which reimagined storyline did you like most? The one with Dave, the one with Henry, or the one where she divorces Zack? If you could reimagine Lane's life, what would you decide to do? If you like this video, of course, you can like and subscribe if you'd like. If you want more Gilmore Girls content, on my Patreon I have a audio recording, because podcast is too generous a term, but I talk about my favourite characters from the show, why Logan is Rory's best boyfriend, and why I don't like Rory and Lorelai. I also have an audio recording in which I talk about the first episode of The OC. I give my first impressions. I also have a write-up about the film Columbus. It's an independent film about modernist architecture, which I absolutely love, and I explain why the film's so great and why people should give it a chance. In the description you will find a bunch of my socials, and if you feel so inclined, you can follow me on there. Hope to see you somewhere on the internet. Until next time, bye.